sir, wake up, open your eyes, let's go. Open the door, get out of the car, now.
Wait, I was just sleeping.
Out of the car, hands where I can see him.
Okay.
Move,
Please, I did.
down, get on the ground.
Ow, I'm down.
Stop resisting.
I'm not.
Just easy, stay still.
It was supposed to be one of the happiest weeks of his life. Raymond Foster, a 64-year-old retired postal worker, had just driven nearly 400 miles from his home in Boise, Idaho, all the way down to the outskirts of Portland to meet his newborn granddaughter for the very first time. He had held that tiny baby girl in his arms, watched her curl her fingers around his thumb, felt that overwhelming rush of love that only grandparents truly understand. For 3 perfect days, he had stayed with his daughter and son-in-law, helping where he could, soaking in every moment of this new chapter in their family story. Now he was heading home. The clock on his dashboard read close to midnight as he crossed back into Washington state. His body ached from the long drive. His eyes were growing heavy, and somewhere in the passenger seat, nestled in a specially designed travel carrier, his beloved pet cockatoo named Snowflake was making soft chirping sounds, seemingly as tired as her owner. Raymond had owned Snowflake for nearly 15 years. The white umbrella cockatoo had been his constant companion ever since his wife passed away, and he rarely went anywhere without her. She was more than a pet. She was family. And on this particular journey, bringing her along had seemed like the most natural thing in the world. After all, he wanted his granddaughter to meet every member of the family, even the feathered ones. But as the miles stretched on and fatigue began to cloud his judgment, Raymond made a decision that would change his life forever. He needed to rest, just for an hour or two, just enough to make it home safely. So when he spotted a small public parking area near a place called Ridgeview Park in a suburb of Spokane, he pulled his faded blue Honda Accord off the main road and found a quiet spot in the corner of the lot. The area was peaceful. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty pavement. In the distance, he could make out the dark silhouettes of trees and what looked like picnic areas. But Raymond was not interested in the scenery. He just wanted to close his eyes, let his muscles relax, and get enough rest to finish his journey. He reclined his seat back, pulled a light jacket over his chest, and within minutes, he was drifting off to sleep. He had no way of knowing that his choice to stop in this particular spot would lead to federal charges, national media attention, and one of the most disturbing cases of police misconduct in recent Washington state history. He had no way of knowing that within the hour he would be lying on the pavement with broken bones, gasping for breath, his face covered in blood. If you have ever been stopped by police for no clear reason, if you have ever felt that creeping fear when someone with a badge decides to make your life difficult, then this story will resonate with you on a deep level. And I need you to stay with me until the end, because what happened to Raymond Foster that night and what happened in the years that followed reveals something important about power, accountability, and the long road to justice. If these kinds of stories matter to you, consider subscribing to this channel because we dive deep into cases that others often overlook. The patrol car approached slowly, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the parking lot. Behind the wheel sat Sergeant Marcus Thornton, a 17-year veteran of the Clark County Sheriff's Office. Thornton had a reputation among his colleagues. Some called him thorough. Others used different words when speaking off the record. He was known for his aggressive approach to what he called proactive policing, and he had accumulated a handful of citizen complaints over the years, none of which had ever resulted in serious disciplinary action. On this particular night, September 7th, 2023, Thornton was working the late shift in the western portion of the county. It was a quiet evening, not much happening, the kind of shift that could make some officers relax and others grow restless with boredom. Thornton fell into the latter category. When he spotted the lone vehicle parked in the far corner of the lot near Ridgeview Park, his interest was immediately piqued. He ran the plates. Nothing came back. The vehicle was registered to a Raymond W. Foster of Boise, Idaho. No warrants, no flags, just an out-of-state car parked in a public lot late at night. For most officers, this would have been the end of the interaction. Perhaps a quick check to make sure the driver was okay, followed by a friendly suggestion to find a safer place to rest. But Thornton saw something else. He saw an opportunity. Raymond was startled awake by a sharp knock on his window. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was or what was happening. Then he saw the flashlight beam cutting through the glass, the uniformed figure standing beside his car, and his confusion slowly gave way to understanding. A police officer, probably just checking on him. Nothing to worry about. He rolled down his window, squinting against the brightness of the flashlight. "Evening, officer," Raymond said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Is everything all right?" Sergeant Thornton did not return the greeting. Instead, he shined his light around the interior of the car, his gaze lingering on the travel carrier in the passenger seat, where Snowflake was now awake and agitated by the sudden disturbance. "You know you are not supposed to be here," Thornton said flatly. "Park is closed after sundown." Raymond blinked, trying to process the statement. He looked around at the parking lot, at the empty spaces, at the distant park facilities that he had barely noticed when he pulled in. "I apologize, officer. I did not realize. I was just driving back from Oregon, and I got too tired to keep going safely. I figured I would rest here for a bit before finishing the drive home." This was a reasonable explanation, the kind of explanation that most people would accept without hesitation. Raymond was not causing any harm. He was not trespassing on private property. He was simply a tired grandfather trying to be responsible about not driving while fatigued. But Thornton was not most people. "That does not matter," the sergeant replied. "You are in violation. I need to see your license and registration." Raymond felt a small flutter of unease in his chest. Something about the officer's tone felt off. There was an edge to it, an undercurrent of hostility that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Still, he wanted to be cooperative. He reached for his wallet and handed over his Idaho driver's license. "I really am sorry about this," Raymond said as Thornton examined the license. "Like I said, I just needed to rest. I am happy to leave right now if that is what you need." Thornton did not respond immediately. He was studying the license, turning it over in his hands, as if looking for something suspicious. Then he walked back to his patrol car, leaving Raymond sitting in confused silence. The minutes stretched on. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Raymond watched in his rearview mirror as Thornton sat in his vehicle, presumably running his information through some kind of database. He felt his initial unease growing into something closer to anxiety. This was taking far too long for what should have been a simple encounter. When Thornton finally returned, his demeanor had shifted. There was something almost predatory in the way he approached the vehicle this time, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Raymond's heart rate increased. "Officer, have I done something wrong? I said I am willing to leave. I do not understand why this is becoming such a big deal." "I told you to step out of the car." There is a moment in encounters like this when ordinary citizens face an impossible choice. On one hand, they know their rights. They know that they cannot be compelled to exit their vehicle without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. On the other hand, they are acutely aware that the person making demands has a badge, a weapon, and the power to make their life very difficult. Most people comply. Most people decide that asserting their rights is simply not worth the potential consequences. Raymond Foster was not most people. He had spent his entire adult life playing by the rules, respecting authority, trusting that the system would treat him fairly if he just did the right thing. But something about this situation struck him as fundamentally wrong. He had not committed any crime. He was not a threat to anyone. And the officer standing beside his window seemed more interested in escalation than resolution. "Officer, I need you to explain to me why I have to get out of my car," Raymond said, keeping his voice as calm and respectful as possible. "I have not done anything wrong. I was just sleeping in a public parking lot." Thornton's jaw tightened. "This is not a debate. Step out of the vehicle. Now." "Am I being detained? Am I free to leave?" The question hung in the air between them. It was a simple question, really, the kind of question that any citizen has the right to ask when confronted by law enforcement. But the way Thornton reacted, you would have thought Raymond had hurled an insult. "You are not free to leave," Thornton said through gritted teeth. "Then I need to know what crime I am being accused of, officer. What is your reasonable suspicion for detaining me?" This is where the encounter should have ended. If Thornton had any legitimate basis for the detention, he should have been able to articulate it clearly. Instead, he gave an answer that would later be played in courtrooms and broadcast across news programs nationwide. "Because you are being disrespectful." Let that sink in for a moment. A 64-year-old grandfather guilty of nothing more than taking a nap in a parking lot was being told that he was not free to leave because the officer found his questions disrespectful, not because he had committed a crime, not because he posed any threat to public safety, but because he had the audacity to ask why his rights were being violated. Think about what that means. Think about the implications. If being disrespectful is grounds for detention, then the Fourth Amendment means nothing. If police officers can hold you against your will simply because they do not like your attitude, then every interaction with law enforcement becomes a test of submission rather than an exercise in legitimate policing. And here's the thing that makes this even more troubling. The entire premise of the stop was flawed from the beginning. Thornton had claimed that Raymond was violating some kind of park curfew by being in the parking lot after dark. But subsequent investigation would reveal that the parking area where Raymond had stopped was not actually part of Ridgeview Park. It was a separate public lot maintained by the county, and there was no ordinance prohibiting parking there at any hour. In other words, Raymond Foster had not broken any law, not a single one. The officer's stated justification for the encounter was legally incorrect, and now that same officer was detaining a citizen for the crime of asking questions. If you're watching this and feeling your blood pressure rise, I understand. These kinds of stories hit different when you realize they could happen to anyone, to you, to your parents, to your grandparents. If you have thoughts about what Raymond should have done at this point, drop them in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you would have handled this situation. What happened next unfolded with a terrible inevitability. Raymond, growing increasingly alarmed by the officer's behavior, made the decision to invoke his rights more explicitly. He told Thornton that he did not consent to any searches, that he wanted to speak with the supervisor, and that he intended to file a complaint about the handling of this encounter. In a just world, these statements would have prompted Thornton to reassess his approach. Perhaps he would have realized that he was on shaky legal ground. Perhaps he would have recognized that his behavior was being recorded by his own body camera and that everything he said and did would eventually be reviewed. Perhaps he would have simply let Raymond go with a warning and moved on with his night. But we do not live in a just world. We live in a world where some people respond to challenges of their authority with violence. "Get out of the car," Thornton repeated one final time. "This is your last warning." "Officer, I am not going to get out of my car until you tell me what crime I have committed. I have been cooperative. I have answered your questions. I offered to leave when you first approached me. I do not understand why this is escalating." What happened in the next several seconds would be captured in disturbing detail by Sergeant Thornton's body camera. He reached through the open window and grabbed Raymond by the collar of his jacket. Raymond instinctively pulled back, more out of shock than any intention to resist. This small, reflexive movement would later be cited by Thornton as justification for what followed. The car door was yanked open. Raymond was pulled from the vehicle with such force that he stumbled and fell to his knees on the pavement. Before he could even process what was happening, he felt a crushing weight on his back as Thornton dropped a knee into his spine. "Stop resisting!" Thornton shouted, even though Raymond was doing nothing of the sort. He was 64 years old, unarmed, and had been peacefully sleeping in his car just minutes earlier. The only thing he was resisting was the complete destruction of his basic dignity as a human being. But the weight on his back only increased. He felt his arms being wrenched behind him, felt the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. And then, without any warning, he felt a series of devastating blows to his midsection. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Each strike sent shockwaves through his entire body. He could feel something giving way inside him, feel the crunch of bone against whatever was hitting him. Later, medical professionals would determine that he had sustained 9 fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, a severe brain injury, and damage to his left shoulder that would require months of physical therapy. His lower lip had been split open so badly that it would leave permanent scarring. But in that moment, all Raymond knew was agony. He could not breathe. He could not speak. He could not even cry out. He simply lay there on the cold pavement, watching his own blood pool beneath his face, wondering if he was going to die in this parking lot hundreds of miles from home. Inside the car, Snowflake was going wild. The cockatoo was screaming and flapping frantically in her carrier, as if she could somehow intervene on behalf of her owner. The sound was heartbreaking. This creature that had been Raymond's companion for 15 years, the living link to his late wife, was witnessing her owner being brutalized and could do nothing to stop it. At some point during the assault, Sergeant Thornton reached down and deactivated the audio recording on his body camera. The visual footage would continue, capturing the aftermath of the beating in silent, damning detail. But the audio, the part that would have recorded whatever justifications Thornton might have offered, whatever sounds Raymond made as he lay broken on the ground, was deliberately eliminated. This was not a technical malfunction. This was not an accident. This was a conscious decision by a law enforcement officer to destroy evidence of his own misconduct. And, as we will see, it would not be the last time Thornton attempted to manipulate the official record of what happened that night. By the time backup units arrived, Raymond Foster was barely conscious. He lay in a crumpled heap beside his vehicle, his breathing shallow and labored, his face a mask of blood and swelling. The officers who arrived on scene would later report that Thornton seemed calm, almost casual, as he explained that the suspect had resisted arrest and that force had been necessary to gain compliance. One of the responding officers, a younger deputy named Harris, made a comment that would later be noted in internal investigation documents. He looked at the elderly man lying motionless on the ground and said something along the lines of, "Wow, he really did not want to cooperate, huh?" This was followed by laughter from several officers at the scene. Let me repeat that. Multiple law enforcement officers stood over the broken body of a 64-year-old grandfather and laughed. This is what happens when a culture of impunity takes root in a department. This is what happens when officers are trained to view citizens as adversaries rather than as the people they are sworn to protect. This is what happens when oversight fails and accountability becomes a joke. The physical injuries that Raymond Foster sustained that night were devastating, but in some ways the casual cruelty of those officers standing over him, making jokes while he struggled to breathe, represented something even more disturbing about the state of American policing. Raymond was transported to St. Michael's Medical Center, where he would spend the next 11 days in intensive care. His family was notified. His daughter, the same daughter whose newborn child he had traveled so far to meet, rushed to his bedside along with her husband. What they found was almost unrecognizable as the man who had left their home just hours earlier. The doctors were blunt. Raymond had suffered life-threatening injuries. His collapsed lung had required emergency intervention. Several of his broken ribs had come dangerously close to puncturing vital organs. The head trauma was severe enough that there were concerns about long-term cognitive effects. He was lucky to be alive. Meanwhile, Sergeant Marcus Thornton was filing his official report of the incident. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn, if such a thing is possible. In his written account, Thornton described approaching a suspicious vehicle in a closed park and encountering an uncooperative subject who refused lawful orders. He claimed that when he attempted to remove the subject from the vehicle for officer safety purposes, the subject became combative and physically resisted. He stated that he had observed what appeared to be multiple knives within the vehicle, which heightened his concern for his own safety and justified the use of force. Every single element of this account was either misleading or outright false. The vehicle was not in a closed park. Raymond was not uncooperative in any meaningful sense. He did not physically resist in any way that would justify the level of force used against him, and those knives that Thornton claimed to have seen. When investigators later examined the body camera footage frame by frame, they found that no knives were visible from Thornton's vantage point at any time during the encounter. This was not a case of an officer misremembering details in the heat of a stressful situation. This was deliberate fabrication. Thornton had beaten an innocent man nearly to death, and now he was lying in official documents to justify his actions. He was inventing threats that did not exist, creating a narrative that would shield him from accountability, and trusting that the system would protect him as it had protected countless officers before. In most cases throughout American history, he would have been right. The vast majority of police brutality cases never result in meaningful consequences for the officers involved. Departments close ranks. Prosecutors decline to file charges. Civilian review boards are toothless and underfunded. The blue wall of silence holds firm, but Raymond Foster's case would prove to be different. And the reasons why tell us something important about what it takes to achieve accountability in a system that is designed to resist it. The first crack in the wall came from an unlikely source, Sheriff William Hartley of the Clark County Sheriff's Office. When the body camera footage from that night was reviewed as part of the standard use of force investigation, Hartley was reportedly troubled by what he saw. The footage showed an elderly man being violently extracted from his vehicle and beaten while making no aggressive movements whatsoever. It showed officers laughing at the scene. And it showed Thornton deliberately disabling his audio recording in the immediate aftermath. To his credit, Hartley did something that many law enforcement leaders in his position might not have done. He initiated a full internal affairs investigation rather than simply rubber stamping Thornton's account. He brought in outside reviewers to examine the footage, and when the evidence became overwhelming, he made a decision that would have significant ramifications for his department. On March 15, 2024, roughly 6 months after the incident, Sergeant Marcus Thornton was terminated from the Clark County Sheriff's Office. In a statement announcing the decision, Sheriff Hartley noted that Thornton had violated multiple departmental policies regarding use of force, evidence preservation, and truthful reporting. The statement stopped short of calling Thornton's actions criminal, but the implication was clear. Additionally, several other officers who had been present at the scene received formal disciplinary action. Deputy Harris, who had made the joking comment about Raymond not wanting to cooperate, was suspended without pay. Others received written reprimands that would remain in their permanent files. For Raymond Foster and his family, this was a significant victory, but it was not justice. Not really. A man had lost his job for brutally beating an innocent grandfather. That was progress, certainly, but it was the bare minimum of what should happen when someone in a position of authority commits such a grievous abuse of power. The criminal justice system would have to take things further. In the months following his termination, Thornton hired a defense attorney named Gerald Whitmore to represent his interests. Whitmore was a well-known figure in law enforcement circles, someone who had built a career defending officers accused of misconduct. He was good at his job. He knew how to frame narratives, how to play on public sympathies, how to make juries see things from the officer's perspective. When asked about his client's case, Whitmore gave a statement that would become one of the most controversial quotes of the entire saga. Speaking to local media, he said, "My client did what he was trained to do. He encountered someone who refused to follow lawful commands, and he took appropriate action to control the situation. The fact that we are even discussing criminal charges for a police officer who was simply doing his job shows how far we have fallen as a society. Citizens do not get to decide which laws they will follow and which they will ignore." Think about that statement for a moment. Whitmore was essentially arguing that citizens have an obligation to comply with any command issued by a police officer, regardless of whether that command is lawful, regardless of whether the officer has any legitimate reason to be issuing orders in the first place. He was arguing that the mere act of asking questions, of asserting your constitutional rights, is grounds for violent suppression. This is the mentality that enables police brutality. This is the ideology that treats the badge as a license for absolute authority. And unfortunately, it is a mentality that has defenders in every corner of the American legal system. But in this case, those defenders would eventually lose. The federal investigation into the Raymond Foster case began quietly in the summer of 2024. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had been monitoring the case since the body camera footage first began circulating online. What they saw troubled them deeply. Here was clear video evidence of an officer using excessive force against a compliant citizen, followed by apparent evidence tampering and falsification of official documents. Federal civil rights cases against police officers are notoriously difficult to prosecute. The legal standard requires proving that the officer willfully violated someone's constitutional rights, meaning they knew what they were doing was wrong and chose to do it anyway. Prosecutors cannot simply show that an officer made a mistake or exercised poor judgment. They have to demonstrate criminal intent. In most cases, this standard is nearly impossible to meet. Officers can almost always claim that they genuinely believed their actions were justified, that they perceived a threat that may not have been visible to outside observers, that their training led them to respond the way they did. These defenses are usually enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. But the Foster case had something that most police brutality cases do not have: the audio cutoff. When Thornton reached down and deliberately disabled the audio recording on his body camera, he was not making a split-second decision in the heat of a confrontation. The violence was already over. Raymond was already on the ground, incapacitated and helpless. There was no tactical reason to turn off the audio. The only possible explanation was that Thornton wanted to prevent the recording of whatever he was about to say or do. This single action transformed the case. It moved Thornton from the category of officers who might have used excessive force in a chaotic situation to the category of officers who knew they had done something wrong and actively tried to cover it up. Combined with the demonstrably false statements in his official report, it painted a picture of someone who was fully aware that his actions were indefensible. On November 3, 2025, a federal grand jury in Washington state returned a 2-count indictment against Marcus Thornton. The first count charged him with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal civil rights violation that carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000 to $250,000. The second count charged him with falsification of records in connection with a federal investigation, which carries an even more severe maximum penalty of 20 years imprisonment and a fine of up to $4 million. When the indictment was announced, Raymond Foster was sitting in his living room in Boise, surrounded by his family. His daughter was there, his son-in-law was there, and his granddaughter, now more than 2 years old and walking on her own, was playing nearby, oblivious to the significance of what was happening on the television screen. Raymond watched the news coverage in silence. He was not the same man who had set out on that road trip to meet his granddaughter for the first time. The physical injuries had mostly healed, though he still experienced pain from the rib fractures and limited mobility in his shoulder. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. He had trouble sleeping. He was anxious in public places. The sight of a police car in his rearview mirror made his heart race and his palms sweat. What he felt in that moment, watching the announcement of federal charges against the man who had beaten him, was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated, a mixture of relief and sadness and exhaustion. Relief that his ordeal had not been for nothing, that someone in a position of authority had looked at what happened to him and said this was wrong. Sadness that it had taken so long, that so much suffering had been necessary to reach this point, and exhaustion from carrying the weight of this experience for more than 2 years. "Do you feel like this is justice?" his daughter asked him. Raymond thought about the question for a long time before answering. "I feel like this is a start," he finally said. "Justice would be making sure this never happens to anyone else. We are not there yet." The criminal case against Marcus Thornton is still pending as of this recording. He has pleaded not guilty to both counts and maintains that his actions were justified. His attorney, Gerald Whitmore, has continued to make public statements defending his client, arguing that the federal government is overreaching and that police officers across the country should be alarmed by this prosecution. In addition to the criminal charges, Raymond Foster has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Thornton personally and against the Clark County Sheriff's Office as an institution. The lawsuit alleges that the department failed to properly train and supervise its officers, that it ignored warning signs of Thornton's aggressive behavior, and that it bears responsibility for the injuries Raymond sustained. These civil cases often take years to resolve, and the outcomes are never guaranteed. But the fact that Raymond was willing to pursue this fight, despite everything he had been through, speaks to something important about his character. He could have taken a settlement and walked away. He could have tried to put the whole nightmare behind him and focus on spending time with his family. Instead, he chose to continue standing up, to continue demanding accountability, to continue insisting that what happened to him mattered. Let me ask you something. If you were in Raymond's position, would you have made the same choice? Would you have had the strength to keep fighting after everything he went through? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know how this story lands for you. The case of Raymond Foster raises uncomfortable questions that go far beyond the actions of one rogue officer in one parking lot on one night. It forces us to confront systemic issues that have plagued American policing for generations. How is it possible that an officer like Marcus Thornton could serve for 17 years, accumulating complaints along the way without ever facing serious consequences? How is it possible that he felt comfortable enough to beat an elderly man and then lie about it in official documents, clearly expecting that he would face no repercussions? How is it possible that multiple officers could stand over a severely injured citizen and laugh, apparently unconcerned about any professional or legal consequences? The answers to these questions lie in the structures and cultures of law enforcement institutions. They lie in the power of police unions to shield bad actors from discipline. They lie in the qualified immunity doctrine that makes it nearly impossible to hold officers personally liable for misconduct. They lie in the thin blue line mentality that treats any criticism of police behavior as an attack on all officers everywhere. Changing these structures is difficult. It requires sustained political pressure, legislative reform, and a willingness to confront powerful interests that benefit from the status quo. But cases like Raymond Foster's demonstrate that change is possible when the evidence is clear enough, when the public attention is intense enough, when principled leaders like Sheriff Hartley are willing to break ranks. Accountability can happen. It should not require a video recording to prove that beating an innocent grandfather is wrong. It should not require federal intervention to achieve basic justice. It should not require years of litigation and public pressure to hold one officer responsible for one night of violence. But in the world we live in, sometimes that is what it takes. And so we watch, we document, we share these stories and refuse to let them be forgotten, because every time a case like this is brought into the light, it becomes a little bit harder for the next officer to think they can get away with the same thing. Every time accountability is achieved, it strengthens the expectation that accountability should be the norm rather than the exception. Raymond Foster did not ask to become a symbol of anything. He just wanted to drive home from meeting his granddaughter. He just wanted to take a nap in a parking lot. He just wanted to be treated with basic human dignity by someone whose salary he paid with his tax dollars. Instead, he became a test case for whether our legal system can deliver justice when power is abused. And while the final chapter of his story has not yet been written, the progress so far offers at least a glimmer of hope. For those who wonder whether it is worth speaking up when you see injustice, whether it is worth knowing your rights and asserting them even when doing so carries risks, Raymond Foster's story provides an answer. It was worth it. Not because it was easy, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because staying silent in the face of abuse only ensures that the abuse will continue. The parking lot near Ridgeview Park looks different now. The county has installed additional lighting. Signs have been posted clarifying the rules about parking hours and which areas fall under which jurisdictions. Small changes perhaps, but ones that might prevent the next tired traveler from experiencing the same confusion that Raymond did. Snowflake, the umbrella cockatoo who witnessed her owner's beating, is still alive and still living with Raymond in Boise. She is getting older now, as cockatoos do, but she still makes those distinctive sounds that have been part of Raymond's life for nearly 2 decades. Sometimes, late at night, when Raymond cannot sleep, he sits with her and talks about everything and nothing. She cannot understand what he is saying, of course, but there is comfort in the presence of a creature who has been with you through the worst moments of your life and emerged on the other side. Raymond's granddaughter, the one whose birth prompted that fateful road trip, just celebrated her 2nd birthday. She calls him Papa Ray, though she cannot quite pronounce all the syllables yet. She has no memory of the night her grandfather was beaten nearly to death in a Washington parking lot. She only knows him as the kind man who brings her presents and makes funny faces and lets her pet the big white bird. When she is older, Raymond sometimes thinks he will have to explain to her what happened. He will have to find words for the violence and the fear and the long struggle for justice. He will have to help her understand that the world is sometimes cruel and unfair, but that fighting back is always worth it. He hopes that by the time that conversation happens, the world will have become at least a little bit better. He hopes that stories like his will be remembered as relics of a darker time rather than ongoing realities. He hopes that his granddaughter will grow up in a country where you can take a nap in your car without risking your life. These hopes may seem naive. The problems of police accountability are deep and structural, and they will not be solved by any single case or any single conviction. But hope is sometimes all we have. And as Raymond Foster has learned over these past 2 painful years, hope combined with persistence can sometimes move mountains. So what can we learn from everything that happened? Perhaps the most important lesson is that the fight for justice is never over. It is not a destination that we arrive at and then rest. It is a continuous process of vigilance, accountability, and reform. Every generation has to fight these battles anew, and every generation discovers that the forces of abuse and impunity are always ready to reassert themselves the moment attention wavers. But there is another lesson here too, one that is more personal and more hopeful. It is the lesson that individual courage matters. Raymond Foster did not have to ask those questions during his encounter with Sergeant Thornton. He could have simply complied with every order, handed over his identification without comment, and hoped that cooperation would be enough to protect him. There is no guarantee that things would have turned out differently if he had made that choice. Thornton might have found another excuse to escalate. The violence might have happened regardless. But Raymond made a different choice. He chose to assert his rights. He chose to ask why. And while that choice had terrible immediate consequences, it also created the evidentiary record that would eventually bring his abuser to justice. If Raymond had simply complied, there would have been no verbal exchange for the body camera to capture. There would have been no clear documentation of Thornton's admission that the detention was based on disrespect rather than any legitimate legal concern. The case against Thornton would have been much weaker and the likelihood of accountability much lower. This is not to say that everyone should resist unlawful police commands. That is a deeply personal decision that each individual has to make based on their own circumstances, their own risk tolerance, and their own assessment of the situation. There are many cases where the safest course of action is to comply now and fight later. But Raymond's story reminds us that sometimes fighting in the moment, despite the risks, is what creates the possibility of justice down the road. The federal trial of Marcus Thornton is scheduled to begin in early 2026. Legal observers expect it to be closely watched, not only because of the facts of the case, but because of its implications for police accountability nationwide. If Thornton is convicted, it will send a powerful message that federal prosecutors are willing to pursue civil rights charges even against experienced officers with institutional support. If he is acquitted, it will reinforce the perception that law enforcement officers operate under a different set of rules than ordinary citizens. Whatever the outcome, the case has already had an impact. Other officers in the Clark County Sheriff's Office have reportedly become more cautious about their use of force, more aware that their body cameras are recording, more conscious of the potential consequences of crossing legal and ethical lines. This is not the comprehensive reform that activists have long demanded, but it is something. It is a reminder that accountability in one case can create deterrence in many others. And for Raymond Foster, life goes on. He still lives in the same house in Boise. He still takes Snowflake with him when he travels, though he is more careful now about where he stops to rest. He still visits his daughter and granddaughter when he can, though the long drives take more out of him than they used to. He has become something of an accidental activist, speaking to local groups about civil rights and police accountability. He did not seek this role. It was thrust upon him by circumstances beyond his control. But he has embraced it with the same quiet determination that characterized his response to the violence itself. If his suffering can help prevent someone else from experiencing the same thing, then maybe it was not entirely in vain. The scars will never fully heal, both the physical ones on his body and the invisible ones on his psyche. There are some experiences that change you forever, that divide your life into before and after. The night of September 7th, 2023 was one of those experiences for Raymond Foster, but scars also tell stories. They are reminders that we survived something. They are proof that we were tested and did not break. And sometimes, if we are brave enough to share them, they can help others find the strength to face their own trials. Raymond's granddaughter will grow up knowing that her grandfather was not just a kind old man who made funny faces. She will know that he was someone who stood up for what was right, even when it cost him dearly. She will know that justice does not always come quickly or easily, but that it is always worth pursuing. And maybe, just maybe, she will carry those lessons with her as she makes her own way through a complicated world. As we come to the end of this story, I want to leave you with a question. Not a rhetorical question, but a real one that I genuinely want you to think about and respond to in the comments. If you found yourself in Raymond Foster's position, stop by police for no legitimate reason, ask to provide identification for a violation that did not actually exist, would you assert your rights? Would you ask the questions that Raymond asked? Or would you choose compliance, betting that cooperation would be enough to keep you safe? There is no wrong answer. These are genuinely difficult decisions that reasonable people can disagree about. But thinking through these questions before you find yourself in such a situation can help you respond more thoughtfully if the moment ever comes. And while you are thinking about that, I want to ask you to do one more thing. If this story resonated with you, if it made you angry or sad or hopeful or all of the above, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this because they matter, because the people in them deserve to have their experiences documented and shared, because shining a light on injustice is one of the few tools we have to fight it. Your rights do not disappear just because someone with a badge finds them inconvenient. Your dignity does not evaporate just because you failed to show sufficient deference to authority. These are the principles that Raymond Foster was defending when he asked his questions on that September night. They are the principles that they could have driven home that night with his ribs intact. But we do not know that. We cannot know that. What we do know is that Raymond was within his rights. What we do know is that Thornton had no legitimate legal basis for the detention or the violence that followed. What we do know is that the fault for what happened lies entirely with the officer who chose to escalate a situation that could have been resolved peacefully. And we know that Raymond Foster, 64 years old, driving home from meeting his granddaughter with nothing but love in his heart and a pet cockatoo in his passenger seat, did not deserve what happened to him. No one does. The streetlights still shine over that parking lot near Ridgeview Park. Cars still pull in and out, their drivers oblivious to the history of the pavement beneath their tires. Somewhere in Boise, an old man is teaching his granddaughter how to gently stroke a bird's feathers. Somewhere in Washington, a disgraced former officer is awaiting trial on federal charges. And somewhere in the space between them, a story is still being written. It is a story about power and its abuse, a story about courage and its costs, a story about a system that often fails, but sometimes, just sometimes, manages to deliver something resembling justice. Thank you for staying with me through this entire account. These stories are not easy to tell or to hear, but they need to be told. If you found value in this video, please consider sharing it with others who might benefit from hearing Raymond Foster's story. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss future deep dives into cases like this one. Until next time, remember, your rights only exist if you are willing to defend them. The people who wrote the Constitution knew that. Raymond Foster learned it the hard way, and now, hopefully, you understand it a little better too. Stay safe out there. Ask questions, know your rights, and never let anyone tell you that asserting your dignity makes you deserving of violence. This has been the story of Raymond Foster, a grandfather, a traveler, a man who would not be silenced, and his story is not over yet.